Hello, everyone. I'm Janet Salmons, Research Community Manager for Sage Methodspace, and I'm pleased to be joined here today by Matthew Cronin, and we're going to talk about integrative reviews and some of the implications for those. But first, if you're new to Methodspace, this is a blog community sponsored by Sage Publishing, and we are interested in everything to do with designing, conducting, analyzing research, writing about it, sharing results in all kinds of ways. And you can see at the center of this Venn diagram, we have teaching and learning, because we think that whether you are a brand new researcher or an experienced researcher, we all have something to learn. And that's what keeps me excited and why I'm pleased to have this kind of opportunity. We're featuring this special issue collection about review research, and your article is one of those in that collection. But why don't you just start by introducing yourself?
So thank you, Janet, and thank you for inviting me to do this. So I'm Matt Cronin, and I'm a professor in the School of Business at George Mason University. I'm currently the co-editor-in-chief of the Academy of Management Annals with my co-editor, Elizabeth George, who is also the author of this work that we put together. And it actually comes out of the time when we were both associate editors at the Academy of Management Annals, and we're sort of thinking more and more about what an integrative review is and should do. The other thing I guess I would say is I'm very interested in how the field, meaning sort of management scholarship, creates knowledge, which is both a process of production and dissemination, and how we can sort of make that more efficient and effective.
Right. So your article about about integrative reviews, in this you said an integrative review enables synthesis of knowledge from across the research approaches in a fragmented field. And when I read that, I thought about the ways that, whatever discipline we might be in, that, we're increasingly looking across disciplines for, more understanding of different angles of a particular problem. And we're also, with the internet and with more electronic journals, et cetera, thinking in a more global way where, really, the field might be harder to identify. So tell us how integrative reviews can help us to, navigate in this, very, excitingly diverse world.
Sure. So, even in all cases, people are looking at a topic from a particular lens or a particular perspective. And this can be anything from, and I like that you mentioned global, right? So what a relationship means in Asia is very different in terms of its expectations of what it means in America, or even creativity, right? It's interesting, like the definition of what is creative in China, Pam Hines does some work on this, is different than sort of a lot of the expectations and the sort of assumptions we have here in America. So each of these, no matter what the topic, there's what we would call a community of practice that looks at it. These are people who understand the sort of terms and the tools, the assumptions of how to look at that topic. But these things can be different. And since topics are often big, it can be the proverbial blind man looking at a part of the elephant, right? So an integrative review seeks to get the blind men to talk to each other and think about how stuff fits. So, it's funny, in the Academy of Management, when we tell authors, how are they putting things together, the metaphor that always resonates with most people, and I think it's in the paper, is the Academy of Management Journal, looks at bricks, and the Academy of Management Review looks at houses, and the Annals looks at neighborhoods. And so what that means in an integrative review sense is that you are looking to see houses and materials are being used across these neighborhoods, where if you're looking within the neighborhood, you never see, and you never even imagine the different ways that the things that you do could be done differently. And when you can sort of pull up at that high level, you see a pattern that others have not seen before. And then you can make new kinds of inferences that, kind of change the perspective. So, there's a scientific example of this, which is that when people looked at Saturn back in Galileo's time, they saw this weird looking shape that looked like a planet with two moons at a time and a blob at another time. And it was Christian Huygens who said, I think a ring would explain that, right? That was a leap of imagination that came from putting things together, from seeing the same data differently. So an integrative review allows us to look and see the very same data, but more of it, and see a pattern that we wouldn't have seen otherwise. But that does take creativity.
Right. So yeah, another point from your article was good integrative reviews provide insight on a topic. We use the word insight deliberately. The review does not merely point researchers toward new landscapes, but allows them to see existing ones from a different perspective. And I don't know that, especially for new researchers or even researchers who are accustomed to doing more of a summary style of literature review that just kind of takes into account, well, what's been done before and how can my research build on that research, but to really be looking for insights from the research. So, walk us through that a little bit. What does that mean?
So again, if we think about a traditional review that says, well, X leads to Y, and we've looked at X leads to Y with condition A and condition B and condition C, and it organizes, here's everything. But we ask, what does it mean together? Right? So instead of looking at the links in the model, what does the picture mean as a whole? Instead of talking about what goes in the cells of the table, what are the dimensions of the table that are really important, right? So that's, again, like you think about looking back and seeing the pattern that you couldn't see when you were looking closely. And I think that emerges, and it's when we talk about it being a review, it means all the work is there, right? All the work is laid out, and it often is a mess, right? I mean, this is, the nature of our work is very messy. So it does take, thought to organize it. Whereas, if you think about how do I organize my closet, right? Well, you could think about, I put my shoes here, my shirts there, and my, like there's a lot of different ways you can organize your closet. But if you were thinking, in terms of what do I need this organization for, right? If it's for ease of use when I'm, navigating the seasons, if it's for color coding because I like to sort of see my clothes in different ways. It's funny when you go to thrift stores, they often have the shirts in colors, so if you wanted something orange, you go here, right? You have to, there's a lot of different ways to organize all of this work, but the right way of organizing it gives you that insight where you see connections among the components that you might not have seen before, and that can cause you to imagine new ways to do that research.
Right. So you also talk about the difference between adjudicating finding and redirecting the current stream of work. And, I think, what you're saying kind of speaks to that, rather, not to say that it isn't important to evaluate the quality of the research and to dig into the methods and how it was done, but this idea of using a review to uncover and generate new insights and then point things into a new direction. So tell us a little bit more about that. How does that work? How what would someone how would someone approach a literature review differently if that's what they're looking to accomplish?
So I want to make sure I talk about the adjudication versus redirection, right? Because it's very easy for us to get, this is right and that's wrong. Like that's very easy to get sucked into that. So there was a paper that came out not long ago about the particle or wave theory of ideas, right? Which said you you think about creative ideas as a particle
mhm,
or a wave.
mhm,
And it wasn't to say one is right or one is wrong or one
mhm,
is better or
mhm,
that we should average these things out. It was
mhm,
sort of saying if you want to think about the development of an idea, the particle view is useful for a certain set of approaches, and the wave view is useful for a different set of approaches,
mhm,
right? And so that's the like, most of us think about ideas as particles, discrete bricks that go in a
mhm,
wall, and then we can say, oh, well, that's the brick, right? And not things that are sort of evolving and changing over time, and that may not look the
mhm,
same as that happens. So that's a redirection in how we study creative ideas. Now, when you do that review, how do you do that, right? So, this group, they actually looked at, you know, how have creative ideas been studied? And they found most people are looking at them like the bricks, the particles, right? This is how
mhm,
they are. But then a couple of people had looked at this sort of other way of the sort of development over time. And that was a way to sort of look and say, well, what if we took this more seriously and thought of this as a different kind of approach to studying
mhm,
creative idea development?
mhm.
So again, what's really important is they're not trying to sort of pit one against the other.
Right.
They're trying to expand the way we are thinking by saying, in
Mhm,
addition to this way of thinking, we can also have this way of thinking.
mhm,
And interestingly, in the best integrative review, it all can fit together. So I can actually use something from physics about this, right? If you wanted to understand motion in a space, there's classical mechanics, there's Lagrangian mechanics, and there's Hamiltonian mechanics. And all of them are about motion in a space, but they use different components. And they
mhm,
all can be sort of like you can derive one from another. So in a grid integrative review, as you're looking at all the different things that have been published, you're finding linkages for how one influences the other that maybe those authors didn't realize, but it's
mhm,
implied by what they said.
mhm,
So that really, and by the way, that is really an emergent process. So, getting the review started, as you really get steeped in the literature and you really start to understand it with more nuance, that's when those things sort of emerge. And that's really that's the
mhm.
insight. The insight is like, oh, wait a minute, hold on a second. I see something that I didn't see before.
Right. And I think, I mean, for people who are interested in research methods and are thinking about the ways that they're going to conduct research, I could see how, this kind of review might, help you to think about, well, you know, not only what questions should I ask, how should I go about this? And, what can I learn from the ways that it's been done before, but not necessarily be limited by that. Thinking about people who are trying, emerging and new methods of doing research, they would be in that category of sort of the redirecting of saying, well, okay, how has this topic been explored before? What you what can I do that will help to move this thinking forward, or perhaps reveal something different than was shown in the previous approaches.
Sure, sure. So like to again, like, when you think about how like studying a topic, right? Well, here's what's been done before, and here's a different approach that's been done before, right? Thinking about how do I marry those two, right? Or what does one get me to question on in the other,
Mm,
right? That could be on both the content, what is a question that is not being asked, that needs to be asked, that comes from
mhm,
thinking about those things together, right? And doesn't necessarily come
mhm,
from just thinking about one.
mhm,
Or even again, what is an approach to use, right? I mean, there's
mhm,
some when you think about like studying a dynamic process, right? To review four different people or four different communities that are sort of talking about how a topic should be seen as dynamic and not static, right? Each of them may have had a different
mhm,
approach that they were tried to do to tackle that. Maybe one is using a longitudinal method. Maybe one is using simulation, right? Maybe one is using repeated measures or some other sort of, sort of within and between, like there's a lot of different ways, but like,
mhm,
let's just be simple and think about if you thought about longitudinal work and simulation work, people tend to do one type of method. Our field tends to do one type of method for one kind of, for a particular topic. Thinking about, well, we have all of this longitudinal work. If you wanted to actually model the processes, simulation would be a way to do that. And if you looked at people who were doing simulation work and you thought about what people actually found, you can then start to think, how would I build a simulation that can test more in a more fine-grained way what the people had found. But again, the thing I want to say is, and this is one of the things that makes it difficult, there's not a formula, right?
Right.
There's to look and see, we have all of this knowledge, and here are the different ways people have looked at it. What can I determine from that? That's really the part that makes it very creative, right? Like there's not a formula. There's not a single thing to do. There's a lot of different ways you can do that, which is good and bad. It's good because it's an occasion to be as imaginative as you would like. It's bad because it's difficult to be imaginative and look at what others have looked at and then say, I know we've all seen this before, but here's what we've missed. Here's how it fits together, and here's what we missed.
Right. And so it's perhaps not surprising to those listening that you also write about creativity and have a new book out that's about creativity. So how do you see that creative thinking and creative approaches fitting with integrative reviews and with, kind of research more broadly?
Yeah, so in creativity, the book, is called The Craft of Creativity, and we tried to write that creativity was a skill, and it was something that came out of, regular sort of problem solving, right? So the regular activities, the foundation, but every once in a while, you sort of are forced to change how you're thinking, which, by the way, has its analogs in exploration and exploitation or single and double loop learning. And what's really important is, if you think about the bottom loop, which is what do we know how to do, that is what makes the second loop possible. Given that we've learned this, what else can we do, right? But you can't get to that second loop if you don't have the foundation. So to use yet another analogy, when people play instruments or when they play music, you have to learn to play the instrument before you can get what's in your head out. If you don't have the skill, not only can't you get it out, it actually limits what you can imagine doing. Right. And the more you know about things, the more you can imagine what is possible. Ironically, even the more constrained things are, the more you can imagine how you might break those constraints. And so when you take all of the, work that goes into reviewing a topic and you put it together, when you see where it can't fit, it actually helps focus you on possibly imagining what else might be there. But again, you also have to know what we've seen before. You have to have that fundamental skill, or you can't you can't bring form to what you imagine.
Right. I think about the Bloom's taxonomy, which I call the Swiss Army knife of academic life. But in there, I mean, synthesis in the original version of the taxonomy, the synthesis is at the top. So you have to already have the foundational knowledge and be able to use that knowledge and be able to analyze. So in terms of literature, being able to analyze the literature, being able to look at what's being, which means you need to understand some things in order to really be able to analyze the literature, because otherwise you won't know what they're talking about. But then, and I like the fact that you use that term synthesis in your article, because then it's that, well, then what does this mean? What does, with the lens that I have from my experience, knowledge, position, etc., how can I move this to some other level that
I actually like that
make it relevant today?
Sorry, I didn't interrupt, but
Yes.
I was going to say, I like that you use Bloom's taxonomy, because you're right. Like, people often think, oh, novices are more creative. And it's like, no, they're not. They just think everything is creative because they don't know anything, right? And when you especially in an integrative review, which it doesn't require just like reading all the papers. It actually requires a deeper sense and understanding, almost a kind of a tacit knowledge about how work is really done. Like you could give people a list of how to write an academic paper. That's a far cry from them being able to do it, because there's a lot of nuance that comes from spending a lot of time in a literature and really understanding what it does and doesn't actually mean. And that like I said, that's just the actual craft. That's the actual getting in there and doing it, you know?
Well, I like what you were saying with the, I mean, it's a skill set, which means like any skills we have as people, for some kinds of things come naturally, and others, we need to actually put some effort into acquiring them. And there's some risk involved with being creative, because just as any kind of innovation sort of rocks the boat, any example we choose, thinking technology, culture, whatever, when something different happens, well, it's going to shake things up a little bit. And so there's some courage involved, not only in thinking, looking for those insights, but then, being willing to stand up and say, well, here's what I see.
But I want to also tell you that, like, I think people forget how hard it is to understand what others mean, especially when they're saying something that is new, right? We sort of have a fiction that like any new idea will be welcomed and loved. And certainly Jennifer Mueller's work says no to that. But history tells you the same thing. When the Xeroxographic process was tried to be sold to offices, people said, I just don't see how this is photocopying is going to do anything. Right? We forget how narrowly we see things. And my grandfather has a quote, amateur art is about self-expression and professional art is about communication. And I say that all the time because it's true for us too. For us to get up and say something different, we really got to make sure people are going to understand what we are saying. And getting people to understand what we are saying, especially if it's breaking a perspective, really takes time and care.
Right.
So I would always, getting back to what you said, I would always encourage like an author who is willing to do this, vet your ideas, right? If you're going to make a big model that sort of shakes things up or changes things, make sure people at least get it first. Then we can talk about, sort of like, how do you deal with the feathers that you have ruffled? But I still think, like there's a huge cognitive hurdle that people have to be able to get over to.
Right. Well, is there anything else that you would like to add?
No, I guess I thank you again. Like I said, I would say that, one of the things that I've been going around and sort of talking to different universities about is that knowledge is a production, right? It starts with new ideas. Those ideas have to be sort of empirically vetted. The collections have to be synthesized into theories, and those theories then have to be synthesized by reviews into coherent bodies of knowledge. And that's a long process. So when you and I were talking about like, how do we, science is what we hope will improve society and save a lot of people. It's a long process, like just like with medicine, you don't go from one study out into sort of the market. It takes time and care. And all of these things have to work together. So as we're always thinking about like, whether it's a review or an empirical piece or theory piece, always be thinking, how does this fit in the larger production process? How am I sort of contributing? Because often we don't know. And so we need to make sure it's carefully done. And so that carefully done so that it can fit together in addition to standing on its own.
Right. And I think, increasingly as we look at in our very instant digital world, there's a sense of like, okay, I think this, I can put it online and it's out there. And what's different about what we do as scholars and the kind of commitment it takes to think in longer term ways. Certainly getting the work done in the present is important, but thinking about, over the course of my career, of my work life, how can I build and collaborate with others to really do something that will make a
Well,
difference.
and also to say to our consumers, right, the managers, right, like you wouldn't take a pill that wasn't tested,
Right.
right? So don't listen to ideas that
Right.
haven't been vetted either.
Mhm.
We all really wanted a COVID vaccine, and it took a year, right? And even that was really fast, right? And that was
Mhm.
because Herculean efforts were put together. So again,
Yeah.
like for everything that we put out, a manager should say, this is, everything they see on the internet, like this is a pill. Would I take this without vetting? So that's important.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. And I hope that those viewing will take a look at your article and have a chance to dig into that a little bit more deeply.
Thank you. Thanks again.